Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Where Does It Come From podcast. Today, we're covering a quite sensitive subject. We're talking about ethical funerals and end of life, how we balance the whole area of end of life with sustainability. It's a balance between empathy and sustainability at that worst time of your life, really, or one of the worst times of your life. The bereaved are dealing with shock, with loss, with trying to do what they feel their loved ones would have wanted. And so how does sustainability fit in with this? With me today, I've got two key experts. I've got Claire and Simon here, Claire Lyons and Simon Holden. I won't tell you about them. I will let them tell you about themselves. So welcome, Claire and Simon, to the podcast.
Welcome. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Claire, would you like to go first and tell us a little bit about yourself and why this whole area is important for you?
Yes, and there might be tears, and that's okay, because I'm trying to normalise people being grief in a very practical way. This is a new niche for me. I'm from an eco sort of background, but our very young son died very suddenly in an accident at home in 2019. And so suddenly, unexpectedly, unwantedly, I found myself in the middle of managing grief and trying to fit that into our values and our lifestyle and our beliefs about sustainability. And it was shockingly hard to do. It was hard to find information. It was hard to ask people to join in with us, if you know what I mean, because people have extraordinarily set ideas and views about what funerals look like, about what grief looks like. And so it was a really challenging time. I remember the clearest memory I have, some of it's very foggy, is that people will start sending flowers, and I hate cut flowers. They're all from abroad. They're a sustainability nightmare. They arrive in plastic. They cost a fortune. And I just remember saying to my husband, I can't have them. I don't want them. And of course, they were all going to die quite quickly, which was like the last thing I wanted in the house. So there were lots and lots of sustainability issues that I really struggled with around that time, on top of grief. And it just became a bit of a mission for me. And so now I'm working really hard to try and have those conversations, try and encourage those conversations, try and highlight all the really brilliant things we can do. You know, it's a really important thing for us to think about. It's probably the only shared human experience we have. All of us will lose someone we love, and all of us will die. So, you know, it's a bit silly really not to talk about it. So I find it challenging, but nevertheless I do.
First of all, obviously, it's a terrible situation that you went through. I personally find the whole subject very uncomfortable, so it's something for me as well to try and broaden my thinking into being able to be comfortable talking about this area. Simon, what about you? How did you come into this?
So very much like Claire, just a few years earlier, my own personal experience of bereavement with my dad. It wasn't so much the sustainability for me, it was the lack of options and choice that were and things that were like personal choices that would have fitted to his personality that just weren't available. You know, there was no, it was A, B or C. Which one of those three do you like? There was no real option for personalizing how we remembered him and where he went and where it was that we went to go and see him. And it was the experience, the interaction with the sector itself, with, you know, different organisations that we had to work with, or well, not work with at that point, that we had to engage with my dad's passing. And I just thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. There has to be a not just a more sustainable, but just a more personal way of you know, going through this process. It's not something that people do regularly. It's you know, it's a once or twice in a lifetime that you have to not have a bereavement, but you have to go through the planning of it during a bereavement, the planning of the funeral. And so, yeah, we just looked at it as a group of friends, which is where the Faunus Group came from, and just thought there has to be a better way of going about this. So, yeah, that's why I got involved with it.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, someone once said to me that when you're an entrepreneur, which I guess we all three are, you don't just think something better needs to be done. You then do it. You start doing it, don't you? You think, well, so if not me, then who, sort of thing. So tell us a bit about the Faunus Group, Simon.
So the Faunus Group was formed by a group of very old friends. We've all known each other 20 odd years, all from very different professional backgrounds, but had all had bereavements within an amount of time, and it was literally over dinner. We were sat talking, and I mentioned the idea that I wanted to create a burial ground, which is, which would have been somewhere that I would have been happy for my dad to have gone to and to have gone. And my dad is in Granville's Woods, but yeah, it's and from that. From the development of that conversation, we then seriously started looking at it, put our money where our mouth was, purchased our first site, had to go on a very steep learning curve throughout that process, developed our beta site, our first site, Granville's Woods. From there, we learned a lot about the negative effects that come from burial, and the much more pronounced negative effects that come from dispersal or interment of cremated remains, cremated ashes. That then set us along on a journey to discover more about this. We met our partners in the States, VPI, Embedding Products Inc., who are a research team that had spent many years researching the issues with full body decomposition, and also the issues with cremated remains, and ways of neutralising and mitigating and turning those issues into positives, which was something we wanted to do. My dad was very much an environmentalist before his time. I remember being lectured on plastics in the 80s and things like this. So we very much wanted it to fit in line with our values, which is what we did. That started us on this journey, and after we'd met the research team in the States, that then sent us off in the direction that we have ended up where we are now.
I'm going to come back to that later, because it's fascinating what you do. But I'm just really aware that people listening may not still realise some of the key issues that we've been talking about in the past, and you guys have been working with for a few years now. So Claire, can you outline sort of the scale of the challenge here, some of the high level issues of sustainability at end of life for me, please?
Well, it's sort of everything really, and I try to think of incremental changes, and that's always how I've done my version of eco living, is what's better than, and there's a sliding scale, isn't there? So my house isn't plastic free because I have young children and they have stuff and they go to parties and they get given stuff, but it's a lot less plastic than it used to be, and I feel like we need to do better than what we're doing now. So it's really every aspect you can probably improve on sustainability grounds. So if we think about some of the absolute essentials of a funeral, we think about the cars. Do you have to have the cars? Do you have to have those particular cars? Is there an alternative? Is it better than? If we think about venues, are we taking lots and lots of people from one venue to another venue that's miles away, and we're having all these extra journeys? If we think about the coffin, is that enhancing the earth as it degrades, or is it causing problems as it degrades? If we think about and I fell foul of this, I knew nothing about this 3 years ago. We buried my son in clothing, his normal clothing. We picked out special items. What's really fascinating to me is that I feel the education does need to come to ordinary Joes like me, but it does also need to come to the sector, because we were asked to bring in clothes. So I never thought to question that, because I assumed if there were choices there, I would have been offered the choices, but I wasn't. I was told, you need to bring in some clothes, and I now realise that actually what we're buried in can have a massive impact on the the process itself in terms of helping Mother Nature, but also on the sort of impact in soil health and all those sorts of things. So there's lots and lots of little ways, many of which wouldn't actually, you know, we're not actually asking people to do anything really difficult or anything really different even. You know, your order of service, do you need one? Perhaps you do because it's something you feel people would like to keep. Could it be on forestry, you know, paper? Could it be on recycled paper? Could it be an online version? And, you know, if people want their own copy, they'll print it off. There's so many different aspects of funerals and grief and bereavement that we could just look at again and very gently head in a better direction in terms of the items that we pick and the way in which we do things. And I don't think it is dramatic change in this particular sector. I think it is those small increments. I mean, for example, wool coffins are my latest little thing I like to get on my soapbox about. You know, it's a beautifully sustainable product. It's fabulous in every way. Everyone thinks that, and it is beautifully sustainable until you bury it. And at that point, it becomes a nightmarish product for nature to manage, because, you know, just the inherent changes in when something is buried into how it reacts to the world around it, its environment, is really important in this particular sector. So it's not to say that's not a sustainable product, because it is. It's to say it's not suitable for burial. And so there's lots of little bits there of knowledge that of you know, that we need to get out. We need to get out into the wider world, and that's part of the work that Simon and I are doing, because, as you can hear, we feel very strongly about it.
Absolutely. I think one thing that's very interesting that you said there, that I know we've talked about before, but most people, when they're arranging some kind of end of life ceremony or funeral, they will go to a funeral director. So the funeral directors are the people who are directly liaising with the people in most cases, and so it's got to be about educating them and working with them to get these right messages across. Because, I mean, I'll come on a little bit later to talk about some of the work we've been doing with Rosedale Funeral Homes, but around textiles. But it's the messages. If they don't know, then how are they going to pass that information on to the person at that most vulnerable time? And you talk about mistakes that you made. I mean, I only arranged one funeral in my life, and that was my uncle, and that was probably 10 years ago now. But we got he was cremated, and we chucked his ashes in the sea. I know, I'm horrified to think about it now, you know.
But I do think we need to be kind to ourselves as well, because we make the best decisions that we can in that moment. And if no one tells us different, how can we possibly know? It's not a time of life that you are really in a place to do a lot of research, and that's why I'm really careful not to blame, you know, not to sort of shake sort of fingers at people who've done something historically, because, you know, we all have that's life, and we live and we learn, and hopefully when we learn we improve. So for example, I did my I'm carbon literate. I did my certificate, and I'm now in the process of writing a funeral sector version of that hopefully we can encourage some funeral, you know, directors to send their staff to become carbon literate, to get some of these messages flowing through the system, as it were.
Well, if you're I think if anyone's listening to this, and hopefully people will be from the funeral industry, then that would be something that perhaps you could work with them to pass that out there into the world. Could be a good vehicle.
Yeah, and there is, I mean, it sounds all doom and gloom. There are some really progressive, forward-thinking operators in the sector, and that there are funeral directors that we've met that I'm quite surprised just how forward-thinking they are and how much they're trying to address these sort of things. But, you know, the funeral sector isn't the exception. It's kind of the norm. Every sector, you're going to find people who resist change, people who resist doing things the way it's always been done. You're always going to find that. And education is by far and away the best way of going about it. But it's a taboo subject, you know, like you said at the beginning. It's something that's difficult to talk about. I think the difference from when we first that started out in the sector to now is huge. The death cat, things that happen, that take place all the time in various different towns, inviting people to come in and talk about the subject matter, and trying to educate people before the fact. And that's the thing. If you have the knowledge before, it's not such a big impact. You've got to learn a lot in 2 weeks. Someone passes away, you have to kind of get your head around all of that, and how to do it, and how to arrange a funeral and a wake, and how to keep everyone informed, and then you've got to think about all of the the other side of things as well, which is why it's kind of swept under the carpet a little bit in the funeral sector, because it's the main priority. And with us, we are an environmentally focused, positive impact business. That's what we try and aspire to be. That's what we work very hard to achieve. But ultimately, the bereaved, the family, is the main priority at the end of everything. So yeah, and you've only got that 2 week window. So it's about education before, I think, and just kind of removing a little bit of the taboos around the subject. And people, in other countries in Europe, it's completely normal to talk about how you're going to be dealt with at the end of your life, years before you've died. And
you're right. There is a huge culture thing there, isn't there? There is a huge. We're trying, when you try to make any kind of change, and you're trying to change the culture, then it always takes time, and particularly in this time when everyone's feeling very sensitive anyway, you kind of fall back on tradition. But some of our traditions aren't rooted in something that's sustainable or even necessarily sensible. We just do it because that's the way it's always been done, and that's what we need to question, but in a sensitive way, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, especially when you look at what you're saying about tradition. So I think it's the 1854 thereabouts, that don't quote me on the exact year, but it's there or thereabouts, the Burial Act. Now cremation, that was only legalized in 1888, I think it was, is governed by the 1854. So even just how we look at, and cremation now is 80% of the choice of people in the UK. So 80% of people in the UK choose to be cremated. So burial isn't really the biggest issue. It's part of the issue, but it's we used to look at that, and that's why cremation became, because of use on lands, demand on land, ground contamination, which we didn't really understand 30 years ago, but we understand a lot more now. The Environment Agency brought in, I think it was April last year, 2022, new groundwater contamination regulations for new and extended burial grounds, because it's becoming known that actually if you put lots of burials in one place, it does become a huge problem for that localized environment, and certainly the water courses and the water course dependence further down the line. And it's something that we know about now, and the environmentalist, if you like, or the environmentalism and the process have kind of married, and I think that is quite well known in the sector. So the different governing bodies are all well aware and are all making massive strides to push better practice for burial. But regardless of how far advanced you go with the burial, you've still got the other 80% of the population who choose cremation, and cremation is still pretty much a flame combustion. And it's so burials, it's not just burial. I think just to focus on burial would be wrong. I think it's the whole how do we disperse of our deceased in a respectful and positive way. I think that's the big question.
So just what are some key issues, key problems, I suppose, with cremation then? What are the key environmental no-nos there?
Well, there's the obvious massive resource on natural resource dependency. So you're burning natural gas, it's flame. There are electric cremators that are now being introduced into the UK. It's not for me to comment on their effectiveness, but you are still in that same energy dependent, huge amount of energy dependent for and then ashes afterwards. The cremated ashes, or we call them ashes. We within the company refer to them as cremated remains because they are 99% bone.
Yeah.
They are classed as toxic, so they have a pH of 11.8. They they contain a sodium content. It's like nearly 2,000 times the saline tolerance for any plant in the UK. So the cremated remains, and so there's 1,100 tons of this waste that's then given back to the public to go and go forth and disperse and do what you will. Yeah. So there's lots of issues with cremation. The obvious one is the combustion, but then you've got the ashes problem at the end of it. So it's not a solution. When cremation first came around and legislation was put in place, it was a very tiny way of dispersing our deceased, whereas now it's the main way, and we're still running that on archaic laws, if you like, that haven't really been updated to deal with the increased numbers. So yeah, there's lots of problems with cremation, and obviously burial, lots of land demands, and also the ground contamination issues, which have been addressed by the Environment Agency last year. So yeah, there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, Simon, because I think I was listening to, I can't actually remember where I was listening, and they were talking about old burial grounds and this idea of tradition, and needing them to be very pristine and very manicured, and because that's a way of showing respect. And I would never want to dismiss that. I think that's really important, but also there can be very large areas of land, often in quite high population areas, these very old burial grounds, and there's an opportunity there potentially to take down railings and put in hedges, or rewild some of that area, and I think there's a lot within the sector open for discussion around how we promote and support, how we make it into a much more positive, a whole philosophy, I suppose.
Yeah, just the management of the space. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And yeah, there is huge amount of acreage committed to memorial or interment grounds in the UK, and they could be managed so much better. But half the problem is the contaminant that comes from the cremated remains, and also from body burial. That the grounds people, with the numerous local authority and private operators that we work with, the grounds become contaminated. It's really difficult to produce and grow those things. So it's kind of you need the full circle approach, I think.
So, but you obviously run a woodland area, burial area, as part of your group. So how do you manage that within that?
So that's quite a big question, Jo.
Sorry.
I think the short answer is correctly. If I could give that one. So right from the planting that we do, so we use native localized planting. So we try and recreate, rewild. We work with the local wildlife trusts in the areas of where our sites are to try and improve habitat for species that are critical in those areas, or we know are present. So we try and manage our grounds with the nature that's around the surrounding areas. The practices that we undertake for burial, we bury with RTN, which we'll talk about another podcast maybe, or a later date. I'm not sure.
Do you want to give an overview of what that is now?
So it's a burial product that we use for the interment of ashes and for full body burial. It's a product that negates and turns the negative elements involved with burial and ash interment into a positive. That's done by neutralizing things like the pH and the sodium content that we talked about, and reintroducing the active cultures that then help to break down the bone or the body and quickly transition those into usable micro and macronutrients, and so that the soil fauna can interact with it, and basically it becomes part of nature. So RTN stands for Return to Nature. So we use that product. The way that we manage the grounds, the way that we don't let plastics in, the way that we don't allow for certain types of flower arrangement to be in because of the oasis, and so we have that very strict rule set, if you like. But I don't think that deters people. I think it encourages people, because they know when they come, the grounds will be as per, and the woods will be a woods, and the natural burial sites will be natural burial, rather than it being that kind of mix between the two. And yeah, we try and just recreate and rewild. It's about the site as much as it is about the commercial activity, if that makes sense.
Mm. Mm. And you talked about your soil product, your RTM product, and you talked about how that breaks down things. So does that mean that the soil health is then returned to as you would want it to be over a certain amount of time?
It's not even returned. If you're in a historical, crematorium, memorial grounds or something, it would return the health. But if you resolve the problem before it goes into the ground, or as it's in the ground, then you don't need to restore. You're basically, and I say this very, I don't know, with consideration to the sensitivity of subject matter, but your very being is then returned to the earth. That sounds a little bit hippie,
I like
but
it.
yeah. So if you plant a tree, like my dad at Granville's, he ended up having to cremate him because, like I said, we couldn't find the right place for him. He was mixed with the RTN soil, or his remains were. We planted an elder tree on top of him, with the idea that we can then have some decent elder wine out the old fella, because he never managed to produce any when he was with us. But that tree's now thriving, and the very elements that made up Dad, if you like, now make up that tree. So they've been broken down, and that tree's now Dad. So I talk to that tree like it's Dad, and I think that's kind of the full cycle which I was talking about. It's making sure that whatever we're doing doesn't have that knock-on effect. It's that we are the end of that process. So if you're buried, that's the end of that process. You are then returned to the earth. If your remains come to us, we then return you back, and you become part of that tree, or whatever it is that you want to be.
That's beautiful. That is actually really beautiful. And I remember, conversely to that story, I remember Claire telling me in a past conversation about some studies that were done where tree roots were moving away from the remains because they were so toxic that trees were actively under the soil avoiding the remains. So that is a beautiful story that you've said there. I'm conscious of time.
I like it. I'm just going to sneak in here. I think I like it because it and this again sounds very hippie, which isn't terribly me at all, but I like the idea that death is it stops it being a straight line, birth, death, end, and it creates a circle. And so yes, you do die, but actually there's still connectivity, there's still link, and that's been very powerful as part of my management of grief. That's been very helpful. Yeah,
I think that's because we are all chemicals, aren't we? We're all made of different molecules and chemicals and things, and it's like when we eat food, it turns into, when you've got kids, they grow because they're eating food, so that energy is turning, and it just that energy moving off into something else, really, without getting mega deep here.
No, but it is. I mean, that's exactly where I kind of bought into the whole thing. It's not only the science worked, but actually I really liked where it took me, with my own grief, and that's what it was all about. That's I mean, like myself and Clara, both from the same side of the pavement, if you like, with that same side of the road.
No, it's a lovely thought. I want to move on to talk a little bit about textiles, because obviously I'm obsessed with them. We've been talking over the last year or so about this, and I discovered that from talking to a wonderful funeral home company near us called Rosedale in Suffolk and Norfolk, that really not very much has been done about what you bury people in. And we were talking about the wool shrouds thing earlier, but also people being buried in their their own clothes. So you know, Nike trainers and that lovely suit that you wear, that polyester suit, you know, and people are being buried in those, and there's some dreadful things that are going to then be happening under the ground with those kind of textiles. So we've been working with Rosedale, Where Does It Come From, has been working with Rosedale on looking at different biodegradable natural dyes textiles that we can use for burial and cremation, actually, that are not going to have such harmful effects. I know you've been doing some work on textile testing and coffin testing and that kind of thing, so I wondered if there was anything interesting that you could tell us about that.
Well, yeah, so since Claire introduced us and you sent us your lovely textile selections, we have, or my colleague, or our colleague, Leo, has commenced the very rudimentary testing of the textiles and in our facility in Nottingham. And wow, Joe, is what I would say to you.
That wow good or wow bad?
Yeah. No, wow good.
Well, that's good. Phew.
So the difference in the organic natural fibre. We started or Leo started the study on the 19th of December, and 4 weeks later, it is, yeah, fantastic results. I could already predict exactly what's going to happen, which is no detrimental effect to the.
Oh, that's great.
Starter.
I didn't actually know that, so that's really good news.
Yeah, it's performed really well. We've been quite surprised by it. The problem with any sort of fabric or a garment that's in between, and this is a little bit, you know, close to the bone, so you might want to edit this, I don't know, Joe. Anything that sits between cadaver and the decomposition material, which is the soil or the earth or whatever that's behind it, it is a barrier. It's direct contact that affects decomposition, and it's the cultures, the biology that's in there, the bacteria, enzymes, microorganisms that are in that soil that are then going to speed up and make a very positive decomposition. So the more barriers and layers you put between, the slower and the more difficult that process is going to be. The more difficult the process, the more it's the sort of thing you don't want to think about. But the quicker the process, the more it's, you know, it's nature doing nature. But the problem is we take cadavers down to a certain depth of soil where the natural culture isn't there for decomposition. We then take away all of the oxygen. You know, decomposition is an aerobic process. So if you take away that, you then become an aerobic hypoxic decomposition, which creates its own issues. And so, yeah, the easier or the better the decomposition process or the burial process, the more it fits with what people think is happening. The more barriers that you put between, you know, these great big caskets that don't breathe and, you know, they're made out of whatever, the more the things that you don't want to think about are going to be taking place. So it's a strange one.
It's really interesting. I think it's something we need to come back to on another podcast, actually, when we've got some more information about the trials that we're going to be running with Rosedale as well. So definitely want to come back to that. So thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time. So just to sort of end it, we want to talk about some of the good things that are happening in this area, because it can be, as we said, quite a sensitive area. And I think one of the challenges that we always have is how we are feeling as the people arranging the end of life situation, in terms of our own grief. It's things like funeral planning and education that we've talked about before, but what good things do you think are coming along and that are being worked on that will make this situation easier going forward? Claire?
I mean, I do think that COVID is sort of gave opportunities perhaps for people to have more open conversations, and I do think that started. So I think we are thinking about making a will. That doesn't seem as taboo anymore. We are thinking about leaving a letter of wishes maybe, that express how we feel, and I think that's really valuable. I think there's been brilliant things. So, you know, lots of people know about different types of coffin now. Lots of people talk about cardboard and they talk about willow. And again, I would go back to my better than listing. You know, willow is better than plastic, but willow made by Sophia Campbell Shaw, down, you know, British grown and British made, is better than one from China. So everything can be better than, even if we're talking in these really broad categories. I think that people are more conscious. I think funnily enough, the thing I'm working on at the minute is floristry. Simon touched on it, and actually trying to, you know, think about native flowers, think about you know, do you need a plastic container for them, or could you be doing that in a more natural way? I do see massive positivity, and I do feel that we're all ready now to talk about it and think about it and make those different decisions. And I think COVID kind of gave a bit of a stopgap. I mean, obviously you know, some people had very difficult experiences, and I don't want to minimize that. But I feel like it was a sort of break in normal in long enough to give us the chance to think again and think fresh, and not necessarily just go back to how it was, but to move forward.
Simon, do you have anything that you think's been positive, really positive, that's happening?
Yeah, so we work with, so in a slightly different tact to my conscience, which is Claire, my social conscience, which is Claire Lyons. Looking at the industry as a whole, so I just feel that organisations like the ICCN, FBCA, the Cremation Society are all very much, which are the governing bodies that look after and, if you like, oversee the funeral sector, or certainly the commercial side of the funeral sector in the UK, are acknowledging that there is a need for change, that they are starting to put these things in place. They're starting to move towards. They're regularly holding, you know, environmental conferences and trying to engage their members into a better practice, if you will. You got people like the Good Funeral Guide, the Full Circle, who are currently trying to make great strides into promoting a better practice, environmental, sustainable practice within the industry. So yeah, I think the sector's kind of waking up. Local authorities, we're finding, are starting to engage a lot more with the sort of things that we do. Is that you've got still that juggernaut of the private sector, which is the money aspect, which maybe is going to be the biggest boat to change and the hardest thing to get a reaction from. But yeah, I can see positive things in the way that the industry and the sector is starting to adapt and change to the demands, if you like, of the public.
That's good to know. Good to know, definitely. Right. Well, just last of all, then, can you, Claire, I think, tell everyone where people can find you, find out more about what you do.
Right. So there's quite a few, touch points, we call them, don't we? So I guess the one I'm most proud of or most connected to is the Woodland. So woodlandburialcompany.com. That's where my son is, and that's the place that I first met Simon and just started to discover this whole world that I knew nothing about, really. Not a club I wanted to join, but I've met good people in there. I would also really encourage people to find out more about the sort of impact of ashes, which is livingmemorial.co.uk. I think that's really powerful. If you want to hear my ranting about grief, I'm just on clairelyons.co.uk. I like to share my feelings openly. And then the Faunus Group, which is sort of the umbrella pushing forward so many of these innovations, is faunusgroup.co.uk. Lots of research there for you to do.
Anything to add, Simon, on any more touch points?
No, other than cheers, Claire. Great job.
I knew she'd know it all off the top of her head, so I asked her. Well, hopefully, if anyone's got anything they want to get back to any of us on, please do. But especially other areas you might like us to cover in this, and we'll make this a series of podcasts about the issues surrounding being sustainable at the end of life. I'd really like to do that, and if these guys would like to do that as well, that would be great. It's ongoing work for all of us. And last of all, I'd like to say thank you so much to Claire and Simon for joining me on the Where Does It Come From podcast. It's been really interesting and educational. Hope you've enjoyed it.
Always lovely to see you, Jo.
And yeah, thank you for having us.
Bye.
Cheers. Take care. See you later.
Bye.